Hello. Good evening. Hi. Hi. Thanks for saying hi back. Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much. Sorry to interrupt. The conversations can continue after the talk, no worries. Thank you so much for joining us this evening, and welcome to the 2025 Arnold and Augusta Newman Lecture in Photography here at MIA. I'm Leslie Ureña, and I am Associate Curator of Global Contemporary Art here at the Minneapolis Institute of Art. And I'm stepping in for our colleague, Casey Riley, Chair of Global Contemporary Art and Curator of Photography and New Media, who unfortunately could not join us today because she's not feeling well this evening. So I am, though, delighted to welcome you all to this year's lecture with the artist Stephanie Syjuco. I'll say a few words about Stephanie in a moment, but I wanted to begin by expressing my heartfelt thanks to the Arnold and Augusta Newman Foundation and Eric Newman and Janice Gepner in particular for endowing this important lecture series on photography at MIA. Eric and Janice were very much looking forward to joining us this evening, but were unfortunately delayed in their travels home from Europe due to an airline strike. Sadly, they're not here, and they're very sorry to miss hearing this year's lecture, but we remain deeply grateful for their support of the museum and its program in photography. And now it's my pleasure to introduce you all to Stephanie Syjuco. Stephanie Syjuco works in photography, sculpture, and installation, moving from handmade and craft-inspired mediums to digital editing and archive excavations. Recently, she has focused on how photography and image-based processes are implicated in the construction of exclusionary narratives of history and citizenship. Born in the Philippines, she is the recipient of a Guggenheim Fellowship and is in the collections of the Museum of Modern Art, the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York, the Getty Museum, and the San Francisco Museum of Art, Modern Art, among others, and also in Mia's collection. And she is a professor at the University of Berkeley, University of California at Berkeley, and resides in Oakland, California. And after her talk, I'll join her on stage for a few questions from the audience, and please hold your questions, and we look forward to hearing more from you. And thank you, and please welcome Stephanie.
Woohoo, what a wonderful introduction. Hi, Minneapolis. How are you doing tonight? So I have to say, I'm actually really impressed that most of you are sitting kind of in the front. I'm used to speaking in lecture halls at schools in which all the students are in the back. So you're already a really wonderful audience. I also just want to take the temperature. Before I start, how many here are self-proclaimed photographers? Oh, wow, look, okay, great. I hope, so I'm actually, I'm not a photographer, but I will talk about photography, I'll talk about image making and the ways in which I implicate photography in different ways. It's a pleasure to be here. My talk is a bit lengthy actually, but let me explain why. So, rogue states and unruly archives on the recent before times and the now times. I'm kind of picking from artworks from about the last 6 years, or actually 8 years. And when I say the recent before times, I mean really the 2016 presidential election. And we're obviously kind of going through a sort of recycling of it, but amplified. And so I'm picking artworks that also respond to the work that I have in the MIA collection. So that's up on view right now. But let me just start. So, hang on. I also want to keep time here so that I make sure that I don't go over. I've got a lot to cover actually, so I'm going to cram it into 40 minutes if possible. Okay, so my work recycles, copies, resuscitates, warps, reframes, rips off, plunders, and hinges on existing forms and historical archives, because the past is still unfinished business. And so some of the creative tactics that I employ, obfuscating, layering or piling, fragmenting or damaging, crumpling, folding, selective cropping, editing, framing, pixelating, downsampling, blurring, removing, healing, inverting, reversing, presenting in as-is condition, rephotographing, republishing, reprinting, revealing, releasing, and re-archiving. So that sounds like a lot, but I was thinking too of Richard Serra's verb list. And when thinking about images, I also want to give some background. I am a sculptor, trained in sculpture and installation work. So a lot of my work previously were large-scale installations in which there was a production of hundreds, sometimes thousands of objects. And I would collaborate with museums and institutions to have a kind of public interface. Since about maybe 2016 or so, I started moving closer to photography and image-based processes. I'm also going to start off with this image, which is not an artwork per se, but something in which I keep coming back to. It's a portrait of myself with my mother at Disneyland in 1979. So Frontierland, which is the kind of faux Western park area of Disneyland, they have this wonderful photo studio where you can dress up in these kind of pioneer outfits. And so at this point, I was 4 years old, and I had just moved to the US with my mother from the Philippines, and we were trying on these, this kind of persona of new Americans. And it's fascinating because you think of this 19th century studio portraiture done very cheaply, very kind of fake in this Disneyland scenario, and thinking about what an odd photo this is. This idea too that to become an American, we had to kind of fit into this like pioneer, settler kind of sensibility. The irony also being that from the Philippines, in which it was a former US colony, there had already been this kind of exchange for a very long time. We might be newish to the United States, but the United States was not new to us. Whenever I also think about photography or the things I'm interested in, it's really more about the apparatus of photography. So I'm showing this kind of stock photo of a typical photo studio backdrop scene with like a green screen and lighting kit and everything. And what's interesting for me about a photo like this is that all the accessories are actually in the frame. They're kind of like taking over the area that's supposed to be photographed. And so when thinking about also the digital processes of photography, those of you that use Photoshop or any kind of digital mediums, you might be familiar already with the chroma key green screen backdrop. And then this interesting kind of gray and white checkerboard, which I've come to sort of refer to as the Photoshop transparency layer, which is the very last layer in a digital image that you're not supposed to see. The grid-like structure, even though it's very visible to you now, actually denotes a blank space, like a sort of hollowness behind the image. I'm also thinking a lot about the fabrication of images and how we interface with history in terms of these fabrications. The interesting thing about Guerneville, California, just up north from the Bay Area where I'm located, is that every year there's a Civil War reenactment that happens, and it's called Civil War Days, and they literally have Confederate and Union forces, fighting against each other. And then there's a speech at the end where Abraham Lincoln comes forward and proclaims the Union has won. It's a very staged scenario. I'm also interested in how the United States hasn't seemed to have gotten over this moment. It's a recurring kind of like, I wouldn't call it a fantasy, but it's like a haunting in some way. And I've also been really interested in these commercial sewing patterns that are mostly used for theatrical, stage productions of American history. And so using some of these commercial sewing patterns, I worked on a project called The Visible Invisible, and this is from 2018, in which I picked iconic American historical garments using these commercial sewing patterns and sewed them all out of green screen chroma key backdrop fabric. So this is all handmade by myself. I spent about a year working on it. On the left is the Plymouth Pilgrim from a Simplicity pattern. The middle is the most sort of overt, ornate dress, the antebellum Southern dress from Simplicity, and then the Colonial Revolution on the far right from McCall's. And this was shown at the Smithsonian Renwick Gallery, which is the main craft gallery located right across the street from the White House in 2018. And the interesting thing about hand making and handcrafting these things is I wanted to implicate myself in the reconstruction of this American narrative. Green screen backdrop is meant to be projected upon. And so when we think about the ways in which American history itself is a kind of projection that changes depending on who is being projected and who does the projecting and during what times, it's this very malleable history. Alongside with sewing the green fabric, I also learned bonnet making and Victorian ribbon embroidery and crochet lace work. So I literally hand fabricated everything here. Oh, look at that bonnet. Oh my God, so that, I know, right? It's amazing. And, again, to kind of push myself to this point where, if I really wanted to invest in this notion of historical fabrication, I was going to go all the way. And there's also something very costumey about these because they're not authentic. Any historical textiles person would attest to that there's this kind of collapse of what the forms are and this more of a very theatrical component to it. The very back, which I don't think I have I have a full shot later, it's also a quilted, sewn 2-inch by 2-inch gray and white fabric panel that's 12 feet tall by 26 feet wide. So again, like fully fabricated. And yeah, there it is, proof. I did it, I made that bonnet. And so in also thinking about this kind of cinematic quality of history, I did a project around the same time in Moscow, of all places. And this was right during this very small period of time, right before the Russia and US relationships really crashed and it was more difficult to get a visa. For the Moscow Museum of Modern Art, I did a project called Rogue States. And it looks at the very first glance like a kind of United Nations gathering. But when you start to pick apart the flags, you realize, or you might not realize, but maybe you do, that they're fictional flags from quote unquote enemy countries from American and European movies. So these are not real in the sense that they're kind of composites or compilations of this projection of an enemy other. And so when the creation of these rogue states, what they really come from is Casino Royale, Die Hard 2, Indiana Jones, Ace Ventura, but the countries all symbolize a kind of like backwards enemy that is hard to pin down. And I think that construction is also really interesting. And so skipping along, around the same time, I was really looking at contemporary protest movements in the United States that were happening. I'm a professor at UC Berkeley, and after the 2016 presidential elections, there were a lot of protests on campus. There were also a lot of right-wing speakers that were invited to have what were known at the time as free speech. It was called Free Speech Week, and so folks descended from all over the country to UC Berkeley, and student protests came up from it. And in witnessing and viewing it, it was also really interesting to see how it was covered in the news. News reports at the time were very skewed, and it was hard to tell what was happening, and there was a lot of a kind of demonization of anti-fascists. So based on that, I worked on a project called Citizens, which debuted at Ryan Lee Gallery and featured a series of banners that were actually constructed from images that I was downloading from news reports of what was happening on the Berkeley campus, of this one banner that reads, if it was unfurled properly, it would say, "Become ungovernable." And that was a banner that kept popping up at these protests. The way it was being photographed, though, was mostly in a kind of collapsed state. So it was very hard to read and kind of illegible. And so I was recreating them in their illegibility, sewing and also letting the kind of letters be what the image, the picture of it looked like. So it was a kind of translation of a digital space into the real world, similar to this backdrop, the total transparency background from the last project. This is the backside of the quilted panel, so you can see like all the seams and the details of it. And then along with that was a series that's also represented here at MIA, and the portrait series that I called Citizen, and this is Portrait of P, and they're fictional representations of different activists that my students and I were witnessing on campus. And so, knowing that that photography at a certain point can also be very fraught with identification. And that's also a really intense topic today, also with masking and masked individuals. But at the time in 2017, there's a fear of doxing, and there's also a fear of kind of being surveilled by the government. So a lot of activists were covering their faces. And so based on what the students and I were seeing, we decided to kind of create these fictional portraits of people that were, I don't want to say impossible to photograph, but were difficult to kind of like pin down. And the students I was working with, they were queer, trans, women, people of color, folks that saw themselves also as personally attacked by the administration at the time. And so by inserting themselves into these fictional identities, it was a kind of question of like, well, how far would one go in order to defend one's communities? It's, again, it's a fiction. These are not portraits, and I think sometimes people confuse these with portraits of real people. They're also kind of types, honestly. They're a kind of type that you might see in a media image. And attached to that exhibition was a project based on Executive Order 9066, which was the imprisonment or incarceration of Japanese Americans during World War II. And so over 120,000 Japanese and Japanese Americans were rounded up into concentration camps around the country. And in particular, in Oakland, California, I was struck by this image I saw of by Dorothea Lange of a Japanese American grocery store not too far from where I live, in which just after Pearl Harbor, the bombing of Pearl Harbor in Hawaii, the business owner put out a sign in front of his store just proclaiming, "I am an American," understanding that he was going to be a target. The sign was up, but unfortunately it didn't work. He did lose his business and he was shipped off. But this sign has stuck with me. And based on that project, or based on that image, I made a kind of recreation of it, inverted and as a large kind of dividing wall screen. It's all hand sewn, and it's the word American in it is compressed. It's actually, I closed the kind of curtain divider that it had become so that it made the word American compressed and illegible. And the title of the piece is "I Am Anne, ... and it sort of leaves up to question, this notion of if citizenship can be displayed, when can it also be retracted? And attached to that artwork and related to it is a portrait called Total Transparency Filter Portrait of N. And it's a portrait of an undocumented student I was working with at UC Berkeley who, after mentoring her for a number of years, we were realizing that she had a very uncertain future. We weren't sure what was going to happen. And at this time, too, there was always the possibility that she would just disappear. And we were trying to, I wanted to figure out a way to make a portrait of her that protected her, but at the same time didn't deny her ability to be present in some way. And that's a very difficult kind of thing to balance. So with Total Transparency, I printed a sheer chiffon version of that Photoshop backdrop layer, the background layer, and then draped it over her. So you can kind of make out that there's a figure there, but she's unidentifiable. And so she's present, but also protected in a way. Like it's an odd image because you could think of it as at once a disappearance, but also a protective gesture. The irony about making all this work in 2017 was I didn't quite realize that it was still going to be relevant. And there was a time when immediately after I had made this, almost like just a couple years, it was like, oh, this is going to be outdated. This isn't going to be interesting. This is going to be, it will be this relic and a moment of its time. And I think that's, when I talk about the recent before times and the now times, that's kind of like the connection I'm making between things that still keep coming back. So along with that exhibition also were two photographs in a corner. They were, it's Chroma Key Aftermath 1 and Chroma Key Aftermath 2, and these are fabricated sort of scenes of what protests looked like in their aftermath on campus. So after all the sides have receded and left, what's left on the ground is a kind of mix of everything from like broken flags and sticks and rocks and banners and just all the kind of leftovers. And I made them, I fabricated the objects all out of the chroma key green fabric and painted objects. So again, thinking about how, it's hard to tell what side, like what exactly is happening here or who's even on, what the issue is. But it reminded me of how, depending on the news cycles or the news feeds you're looking at, the same scene can say the exact opposite of what the other outlet is saying. Okay, so skipping on to more photographic convention. This is I'm really fascinated by color calibration charts throughout history. They've sometimes been referred to as Shirley cards, which is really great when they have a woman standing in with all this color calibration imaging. This is the Ole no Moire color calibration chart by Adobe Systems in the 1990s. And when I did work as a graphic designer in the 90s, and as I was looking at my images and trying to kind of color correct in Photoshop, this was the print that was given to me to check against, to make sure that all my color was good. And this is hilarious because there's this Carmen Miranda-like figure with, on her hat are fruits and color charts and also Adobe spelled out in what is it, toy cubes. So there are these like odd, color calibration charts become these odd pastiches of normal life, whatever that is. Like, a very kind of affluent fruit and wine still life. This like really lovely, straight marriage. Yeah, and then they get crazy. Then they just, then people are just slamming in everything like candy and fruit and eggs and babies and hot women and landscapes. And because in the end, it's actually, it's supposed to just be this color, this like thing that you look at. And I can't help but just like, think these are crazy still lifes. They get really awesome too when you start getting into the ethnic representations of what color is supposed to look like. So I call this one extreme ethnic performance because they're going really far on it, but they're playing harmoniously together, right? So that's why it's very. They look great. This is the German version. I'm not kidding. This is. There's something about this triad too of like black, white, and Asian. It just keeps popping up. So in thinking about this crazy pastiche of stuff and the logic of the calibration chart and also the sort of normative qualities of what's supposed to be happening in there, I decided to create this large platform installation piece that brought in some of these photographic conventions and intermixing it with this narrative about history and colonialism and how the colonizing entity itself is a kind of enforced normative structure on its colony. So I know that sounds like a lot, but dodge and burn visible storage. It's a large wooden platform with digital photos, printed vinyl, and all these like wonderful fabric backdrops. And when you zoom in, we start to realize that there's a kind of cacophony of objects and flat-fronted prop-like images. I also hand-sewed all the dresses in this particular one. This pulls specifically from the American colonial time of the Philippines in the late 1800s and also early 1900s. So the dresses are from that particular time period. The green one on the left is a kind of what I would call like an American industrialist, a wealthy woman dress, and then the dress on the right is a traditional Filipino terno dress. And then mixed in there are also all these odd references to skin tone charts, color calibration charts, textile images, images downloaded from museum collections. There's also, there's emojis. So there's poop emojis kind of unhappily populating all the mega-like green caps, which are also hanging out there, chroma key green caps, along with chroma key green painted tiki torches. And those figured heavily in the Charlottesville Unite the Right event in 2017, I think. So, it goes in and out between this idea of thinking through images through a kind of colonial past, but also how the present still sort of leaks into it. And this cacophony of things also includes images of Filipino artifacts that are downloaded from the Metropolitan Museum's website and then printed in real life and stuck onto laser-cut wood props. And so it's this kind of like, almost like stealing back some of the objects. There's also these great fruit, stock photo, tropical fruit displays hanging out. And there's also when you kind of move towards the back, you start to see this other scenario happening where there's actually a kind of street battle, honestly, happening that you can kind of view parts of it from the back. And the emojis also you can see only from the sides, and they are a kind of commentary on the things next to them. So skipping right along, in 2019 to 2020, I had the wonderful, distinct pleasure of becoming a Smithsonian Artist Research Fellow. And that was such an honor, and it was really one of the first times I was able to work with archives. So given that this was about 6 years ago now, and since then most of my work has actually pivoted to working with archives directly in institutions. And this was at the National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. What does it look like to work in archives? It's actually really boring looking, but I find it endlessly fascinating because you call forward images and documents, and then you sort of sift through them and try to figure out what you have. In this particular case, I shoot thousands of reference images, and I cull together these kinds of loose narratives that after the fact, then I edit together into different bodies of work. So during the time of it happening, it literally just kind of looks like this. I'm looking for images that kind of look interesting next to each other, similar to maybe what I was doing in the Dodge and Burn installation. And in this case, I was looking for proximities of how the Philippines is represented within an American collection. I'm not interested in knowing more about my heritage or about my own personal connection to, identity or the history of the Philippines. I actually want to know how the empire sees the Philippines. And that's a totally different thing than, say, a personal exploration of identity. So as I'm gathering these things, the question is always like, well, how do you translate this into art? It's like, how do you recycle or reuse it? And a couple ways. One of the instances was an exhibition at Ryan Lee Gallery in 2022, and I created a giant sort of like reference table. So similar to what it's like to sift through on a table within the archive, I created this sort of loose collection and connection of images and references. And it's not very conclusive or cohesive, but what it does is I hope that when people are viewing it, they're actually able to make poetic connections rather than something that's overly didactic. There are certain things that come up, or there's certain ways of seeing how a country or a culture is kind of put into an archival structure. But it's a browsing kind of space. And so this layering of images references everything from, like on the left-hand side are images of black buffalo soldiers that were sent to the Philippines. There's images, that fake gun is actually a souvenir that was brought back from the Philippines when Filipino resistance guerrillas were building fake rifles and weapons in order to try to make it look like they had more in their military might. So there's references that I know, but not necessarily are meant to be explicit. So as you're sort of sifting through this table, or you're looking through the table, on the wall I have chosen some images that reference not just the Philippines, but actually a kind of American history, or ways in which American history is also a kind of projection or an obscure or hazy space. So I became really fascinated with images or photographs or pictures in which it was hard to tell what was happening. And in this particular case, this is Better America, and it's from a poverty lecture slide series in which the image has been so scratched away that you can't tell what's happening. And you're left with this kind of abstract static, or almost like a snow-like color from the 20s. And what you're looking at here, I'm actually, so when I make these photographs, I first take the image that I've shot and I print them on really, really crappy color LaserJet office printers. I taped them together, hang it on my studio wall, and then I take a high-end photo camera and I shoot that. And then I print it as a high-end photograph. So you're sort of seeing this, like, the small image going into a large degraded image and then being turned back into a high resolution image, and complete with tape marks still on there. So with also thinking about the American sort of history of struggle, and if you think about colonialism or the sort of logic that shaped colonialism overseas in the Philippines, you can also then connect it to things that happened on the continent itself. And I was looking at KKK records, the Ku Klux Klan records from the, it turns out their records also exist in the Business Americana section because the KKK were a business. They had dues paid, there were, it was literally, it was a bona fide business. And when going through these kinds of records, I also have to think about, well, what do I want to show and what do I not want to show? What do I think is actually not useful to put back out in the world? And so when I photographed this is the back side of all the files in a particular folder. So after turning them all so they face downwards at the table, I shot it from behind. So as if to kind of deny that message from kind of, pulling forward again. So it's the reverse, and it's all taped together, and it's really large, and you can kind of see, some of the kind of mundane things that were on the back of some of the newspaper clippings, like cookie recipes or, the Poetry Society. And on the other side were the articles of, outlining some of the work of the KKK. Let's see. Also thinking through how photography and imaging happens in other collections. This is an image. It's actually a rejected film box from the studio of H.C. Anderson, who was a black photographer shooting in the 1970s. And this is from the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And what I like about it is that on the box of the, he wrote rejects on the box. And then also I thought it was really fascinating because the image of kind of like what I was referencing as a Shirley card, where the woman is sort of the standard on the front, and this white woman being, the sort of standard that an African-American photographer would have to kind of like reference in this case. And the fun thing about this image is because the image I got from the Smithsonian was so low resolution, I worked with the digital the kind of pixelation of it in the final work as well. So this is how it looked in real life as well. And then this really beautiful thing that happens sometimes to older glass plate negatives. This is a fragment or military officer from the Alexander Schadenberg photographs of the Philippines. This is a Spanish officer, and the kind of degradation and fragmentation on the image is actually happening to it in real life. It's a gorgeous kind of metaphor for the sort of fracturing of, the kind of invisible violence that might have been occurring at the time, and yet, I don't necessarily want to portray that violence, although those types of images exist, but how can we also show how it is inherent to the image or the material itself? And then the last image, which I find actually a kind of antidote to some of the others, this was the most uplifting image of Filipinos that I could find in the American Archive. This is it's a photograph taken in a box. It's by Alexander Alan Sr., who is a Ukrainian Jewish immigrant refugee who came to the United States and set up a photography studio and photographed mostly migrant communities in New York to counter the xenophobia against immigrants at the time. So this beautiful box of Filipinos, Filipino women dancing and joyful, was this really wonderful interruption. And it became this really nice connection to a photographer who had devoted his life to showcasing the immigrant experience in a light that was not very forward at the time. And then moving along, I worked on a project at the Amon Carter Museum of American Art in Fort Worth. And this was a really fun experience because the Amon Carter is founded initially on a collection having to do with a sort of like cowboy motif. So although it's expanded out from that, it's a very interesting example of a kind of story of the American West. And in thinking about their collection, I spent time looking at this sort of the landscape paintings, the ones in which there was also a lot of this like manifest destiny, written forward on these paintings. And it's very typical of their collection. I decided when looking at the paintings, I decided to focus on the hands. There was something really interesting about the verbness, the doing of the hands, whether they were like pulling, pushing, tugging, shooting, reining in things, as well as commanding, pointing, measuring, doing all the sort of things upon like the space or the landscapes in which they were depicted in. So after looking at all these and realizing too, by spending more time with the Albert Bierstadts, which were these gorgeous landscapes that most people are familiar with in terms of their epic scope, but were in many cases, or almost all of them, they were these fantasies. They were incredibly useful in terms of selling the American West and also the sort of expanse of the United States to folks coming in. And they were amplified. They were these sort of theatrical concoctions. So the entryway to the Amon Carter, I was commissioned to work on this, both walls on either side that you had to walk through in order to get to the galleries that actually featured the artwork. And so double vision happened, which came up from referencing those images. And I took the Bierstadts and turned them into these large backdrop landscapes that were then also doubled over and Rorschached, almost like a psychological test, and then overlaid with panels of the hands excerpted from the paintings that you would see on the second floor above, as well as these theatrical kind of digitally printed curtains. And so as you kind of walk through them, you get the sense that there has been this kind of, not quite a manipulation on the landscape, but a positioning, a kind of a way in which the landscape itself is a backdrop for the sort of settler activity. And then along with the Bierstadt landscapes, one of the walls featured it in a kind of chroma key green shade. And I then re-photographed some of the iconic Remington cowboy sculptures using the preparator crew to help me position them against a black satin backdrop, but also leaving their little tags on, their little museum tags, which kind of shrunk them down a lot. You know, when thinking about this iconic cowboy figure, they're so outsized and large in the imagination, but these sculptures were actually quite modest. And by leaving in the little color calibration charts, or in this case, the hands of one of the preparators who, was able to kind of move it and touch it. And then also the hand of the curator, I had measure the object. And then that's on the right hand, my hand kind of inserted into the work. So the cowboys have been sunsetted. They're turning away and backwards from the viewer as if they're sort of receding into the distance. And that show was up for a year, which was really wonderful to have. And I just really appreciate in those instances in which the curator trusts the artist to kind of work together on a project that can respond to the museum. So I've got just a couple more projects to share. A recent project is based on this idea of inherent vice, which is the tendency in physical objects to deteriorate because of the fundamental instability of the components of which they are made, as opposed to deterioration caused by external forces. What does that mean? So there's a kind of natural degradation of paper and material depending on the materials that made it. If you think about like acid or the yellowing of photos or drawings or paper. The tie-in was with an archive that I started looking at in the Philippines at the Lopez Museum and Library. So the Manila Chronicle was a newspaper that existed in the Philippines from 1945 until 1972, when it was shut down by the Marcos government dictatorship. The president of the Philippines at the time was backed by the US government and declared martial law in 1972 and shut down the entirety of the free press. So this archive, this photo morgue, as it's actually called in journalism speak. So the photo morgue is a physical collection of photographs that photojournalists would print with the idea that they might be included in a printed edition of a newspaper. And if that happened or it didn't happen, they were filed away in these physical archives. So the Lopez Museum and Library was essentially a time capsule from 1972. It had just been held there in this moment right before the authoritarian government shut it down. So there's this kind of like amplified images of things like strikes and protests leading up to this silence. And it's not a digitized collection at all, which is amazing in the sense that, you know, a lot of these images have never been shown. By opening them up and researching and looking into it, I was able to see a lot of things that actually the general public was quite unfamiliar with in terms of what gets promoted as the history of that time. And, you know, looking at the backs of these images too, in which like the caption would be put on there or little notations on the size or how the image should be reproduced. I was also really struck by this idea that, so we're talking about a newspaper that has different sections. There's like the front page section, there's also the style section and the culture section. And so concurrently with all this sort of, amplified political activity, there was this also amazing images of this cosmopolitan Filipino culture side by side. So, you know, everything from like beauty pageants and beauty queens to explosions happening on the left side. Everything was also filed in these crazy categories. So there was a category for hair, and that was just everything having to do with hair. It didn't matter like when the hair was or whatever. The same with explosions. And so the also interesting thing were all these headshots of politicians at the time. So this is the headshots of Ferdinand Marcos, who was the dictator who shut down the country. And again, the question of like, how do you depict or re-photograph or re-show the images of him without putting them back out again in an uncritical way? And so for me, it was about sort of like blocking the ways in which he's legible so that you only see the kind of power in his oration or his hands or the kind of podium that he inhabits. But other than that, attempting to kind of like block or neutralize him. What was also amazing were student demonstrators. That also came forward a lot, and these like masses of collections of images of young students who are essentially leading the protest movements. So, you know, when it manifested in an exhibition in the very country in which these things happened in, I was shocked to know that a lot of the younger people in their 20s and 30s that were coming to the show had never seen images like this before. Most of the ones that get trafficked about that time are very sort of standard iconic ones. Like think too about American historical events in which you only know one or two images, like say the Kennedy assassination or Kent State, right? There's like one image that you remember. So all of a sudden there was kind of this flood of other ones. And the young folks, I was really surprised in particular, were like really fascinated by learning through this. So, you know, in thinking through that, this archive itself could keep moving forward somehow and having relevance even 50 years later was really a beautiful discovery. And along with that exhibition, I printed a free poster edition called Phantom Edition Halftone Study 92372, which was a extremely half-toned version of the front page of the last issue of the Manila Chronicle that actually never got distributed. So thousands and thousands of copies were actually printed and produced, but on the day of martial law, they were never sent out. So it became this, it's like news that didn't happen, or news that never got circulated. And so the public was able to kind of take this as a commemoration for that time. I think two more really quickly projects. Most recently, blind spot artifacts at the Bishop Museum in Honolulu. This was for the Hawaii Triennial, and I worked with the museum there to repurpose exhibition casements along with empty museum mounts. So those are the objects that you see on the casements, and I paired them with digitally manipulated photographs. And so as you're circling through the exhibition, you're sort of seeing the metal mounts devoid of their cultural objects, usually an ethnographic object, like say, you know, a musical instrument or a vessel or a, you know, some significant cultural thing. And they've vacated. They've essentially walked away. They haven't disappeared, they've just refused to be present. And the images that accompany them are digitally manipulated ethnographic photographs, specifically of the colonial Philippines, in which I have healed them by using the Photoshop healing brush tool. So for those of you who know digital Photoshop work, the healing brush tool is awesome. It actually was used it was designed to get rid of blemishes on people's faces. You take this wand and you sort of rub it over the thing you don't like, and then it goes away. Well, I did that over the people depicted in these pictures, not because I wanted to rub them out or want them to go away. I just wanted to release them, to let them leave the frame of forever being conscripted into this kind of colonial subject. Because even though this happened, you know, over 100 years ago, they live forever in the archive as this kind of like figure of the colonial subject. So they've been gone. But what's left behind is also this weird sort of like phantom of like this rough, odd, imperfect leftover. Because I also don't want to say that, I'm not trying to deny that history happened and make it seem clean, but that there's this like, this leftover is in their wake. And then this is I think the last project I'm sharing. This just went up 3 weeks ago at the Berkeley Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive, and it's called Present Tense Roll Call. And I call it a love letter to teaching and learning during fraught times. And it literally is a giant physical paper installation. This isn't vinyl flat on the wall. This is physical printed papers pinned like a giant pinboard. Collecting indexes from critical texts having to do with ethnic studies, queer histories, all sorts of things in there as this almost like teaching tool. So the show is up for 10 months, almost a year, and I don't know what the world is gonna look like then, but this is gonna have to be there, and it'll live there. It's also a kind of, UC Berkeley is one of the founding universities for ethnic studies, along with San Francisco State, and that was in the late 60s, early 70s in the Third World Liberation Strike. And so there's a very kind of like connective tissue there with this project living there. And I'm gonna end on a particular image that kind of cycles it back. So one of the only photographs in this installation is of the artist Chiura Obata, a Japanese-American artist who also was a professor at UC Berkeley from the 1930s until the 1960s. And then during World War II, he was taken away and sent to the concentration camps for 3 years. While he was in the camps, he started an art school. The Tan Fran Art School worked with children as well as adults, and then later on, when he was put in yet another camp, he started another art school there. And so it's this look back to sort of pull forward both what a teacher does in terms of how they keep kind of pushing forward and surviving and what they're going to teach the next generation and under what circumstances, which I think, a lot of educators are finding themselves in that quandary now. And one of the beautiful things I want to share too is there's the little boy on the very right. He was 8 years old here. He came to the opening. He's 92 years old now, and his name is Fred Shinoda. And it was absolutely amazing. So he was able to stand in front of the work and see himself, and he was brought by Kimi Kodani Hill, who is Chiura Obata's granddaughter. And when we think about pictures and we see pictures of history, we do think somehow that they're very removed from today. And so Fred became this link that just was really hit home. It was this idea too that there's not an abstraction in images like this. They keep telling their stories and they keep really being in the present. Ooh, excuse me. In the present. So with that, I'm gonna end right there, and I really appreciate it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Stephanie. That was amazing. And I have so many questions. I have all these phrases circled here: refusing to be present, the unfinished business of history, and even this last image here. But because we are short on time, I wanted to open it up to the audience first before I start talking, and I'll ask you later. And we do have colleagues here with microphones, so please wait till they get to you. We are recording the questions for our audiences so they can hear them as well when they watch this later on. So any questions to get us started? Oh, I see one in the back. Thank you.
I wonder, since you ended on teaching, if I could ask a teaching question.
Yeah, go for it.
So you have this rich interdisciplinary practice, and as someone who also teaches and is interdisciplinary, I'm curious what your classroom looks like. I think there's, there's a way that most artists are trained in a discipline and then you stray. And I'm curious, in a world where we could teach something else, but it's really hard, what does teaching look like for you?
That's a great question, right? I mean, well, one, I have to say, so I have a full-time job. That's teaching, right? I mean, that's the thing about being a professor and an artist. In a lot of my projects, they don't sell. You know what I mean? So in a way, like having the job is actually a very practical thing. But then at the same time, if I want to be a good teacher, I'm supposed to develop these classes that also reflect, my interests. And that's part of the beauty of, at Berkeley, we're a research university, and so our classes are supposed to reflect our interests. Specifically, I've developed 2 classes that I like teaching all the time. One is called Art and Archive, and it's awesome. It's interdisciplinary. It's open to any art student who wants to take it. And we go into the Bancroft collection, which is one of the largest collections of West Coast material on campus. And then we just talk through lots of issues of looking at what some people call dead media, but the term is sleeping media, which is much better. So analog things that
So
I love
tell
that.
us what the sleeping media are.
Well, anything, microfilm, slides, all that stuff. And students are fascinated by photos, like physical photos. And, so that becomes this really interesting thing. And then they work on a project. And then the second class that I like teaching that I developed is called Radical Wearables. And it's totally different. So we're going sculptural, crazy performance, like gender bending, insane, things. And then we have this fashion runway walk at the end, which is really performative and amazing. So it's, one is very cerebral as a class, and the other one is very material heavy. And so that reflects my own practice.
And I have a follow-up question on that in terms, because as you were sharing your presentation and the clothing that you were hand sewed, and then you were talking about the archive, and your Artist Research Fellowship as being something that was your first incursion in the archive. I guess in terms of the classes, what inspired, I guess, the sewing? Is that something, did you have a background in hand sewing, and then what inspired the archive as a place to go? How do they intersect?
Yeah, so my background is in sculpture. So, as I was saying, like photography kind of came later, and it's more about imaging, like thinking through images. I'm actually not great with a camera. I have to get a lot of tips from my partner, who actually is a photographer. But so starting off in sculpture, working with textiles, working with a lot of handcrafted. I'm still looking out there, looking at a lot of handcrafted materials. I made them intersect. I don't know if they naturally did that, but I think like with the platform pieces, which I find really exciting. I also forgot to mention that the platform pieces, even though they're very physical, they remind me of digital space, because it's like when you open up too many windows on your screen and everything's kind of overlapped, and it doesn't make sense because you've just like looked at too many odd things all at once. But maybe the archive is as a cerebral kind of like internal space, and then the material world is this like outward-facing space.
Thank you. Any other hand? Yes, I see another hand. Thank you.
This is more a comment than a question, and if you care to elaborate on it some more, but I can't help but notice you're wearing chroma key green.
Yeah, I'm kind of obvious that way, right?
Make sure you match your lecture.
Well, the funny thing is actually, here's the other crazy thing. I have a practice. I knit sweaters based on what I'm working on. Also, really, like, so when I was working on the double vision installation with the landscapes, I was knitting myself a Intarsha landscape sweater. So there's I actually at a certain point, like, I guess I can't turn it off. But yeah, it's related.
It's part of the lecture. We have 2 questions on the right. Or our right, your left.
Thanks for the amazing talk. And I guess I was interested in that, the healing tool as kind of the reverse of that ghost photography that people did in Civil War era, where they would conjure their relatives, but like instead freeing people. And I'm just really curious how you think of as like ghosts and images, and how, those things relate, or if there's some kind of, you feel like some kind of magic is invoked when you do that.
Well, okay, so I started doing this after looking at hundreds, maybe even thousands of colonial era ethnographic photos, they get really there's a lot of them that exist in multiple collections all over the world, everything. And there's this kind of litany of them. And I was just trying to figure out a way of how do you make them more interesting again without re-victimizing the person, in the image? And I actually find these really evocative. They're really weird. There's something oddly digitally stuttery about it too. You can tell when it's like really imperfect. It's by healing it, you're copying the wrong thing somewhere because it just grabs the things around it and it attempts to kind of like fill it in some way. But in the end, for me, they're not disappeared. I really try to insist that because some people think it's like erasing people's lives or histories. I just like to say that they just exited. They left. They just said, we don't want to be a part of this anymore. You can have your picture. You can have your frame. I'm out of it now. And so, but yeah, the spirit photography thing is amazing as well. Like when, whether it was like through double exposure or sometimes even like physical objects were used to simulate a spirit of some kind. And that's a great sort of sleight of hand, sleight of eye.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, we have, I think you may be the last.
Thank you so much. I'm visiting from Arkansas. I'm so happy to catch you by chance, and it's relevant because in my institutional context, there's been a lot of censorship coming down from the state in our art school. And I noticed in particular when you were discussing double vision, you referenced the trust that you were able to cultivate with the curator at that institution and how you were therefore able to take risks that were supported by your host. And so I'm wondering if you could speak at all to some of your tactics as an artist hosted by these very large institutions, maybe how you're able to sidestep or implicate or just the tactics that you use to not self-censor while still managing the platform that they provide.
Yeah, that's a tricky question. I think for the projects that I chose, and there's a lot more. Like I do usually collaborate with museums and collections. So the other examples are like can be actually quite, I think, more amplified. But I mean, in the end, the curator probably by inviting me also starts to understand what the institution can bear. Like they hopefully. And then there's also this notion too that at every turn, the people that work in the museum are, I also don't want to get them into trouble. I also have to kind of figure out what the limits are and then sometimes get close to that, but not enough because this isn't meant to indict, actually. The works they're meant to be critical, but they're not meant to take someone off guard or to shame somebody or to shame an institution. It's actually about like, how can we dialogue around something that, can be engaging critically, of course. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I think there's a lot of time usually spent, I personally spend a lot of time talking to the people in the museums. So whether it's the staff, the curators, the people that, have to somehow support it or implicated in it. And it's, I think it's worked out okay. Like, so interestingly, the Bishop Museum project, right? That's the largest cultural museum in Hawaii. And it's, all the objects that were in those casements were very important cultural objects. They were indigenous, local cultural objects. And we talked through that implication of like, what does it mean to reuse the stands that touched those objects? And at a certain point, they were like, well, they're not the objects, but so we had to kind of talk through a lot of it. And that project also isn't critiquing the Bishop Museum, it's critiquing the museological structure in general as how it frames history. So again, like there's some language around that. The other thing is you could if you ask the curator at the Amon Carter, maybe she has a different story.
We don't know. I don't know.
She had to stay with it, and I got to leave.
Well, Oh, great. Well, maybe one more and then we can close it off. No, we're good. We're good. Yeah, go ahead. Just one.
Hi, Stephanie. So we do know each other, but I did have an identity and kind of culture question, just because, so as a scholar and as somebody in critical Filipinx studies, like, you are taking on really kind of serious things, but then also your work is so funny and playful, and like, I guess I imagine you in your studio, since I have been to your studio. Like, do you just sort of crack yourself up, like, when you're in there looking at something, and like, because some of the stuff is really hilarious, like, like with the dresses, and just that whole assemblage is just ridiculously funny, so, and humor is important in different aspects of Filipino culture. So I was just wondering if you wanted to talk about humor and playfulness and that kind of thing. And thank you so much for your amazing work. Like, it's so important in our field, and we're so grateful for you.
Golly, thank you, God. Thanks for bringing that up. You're right. Like, there is kind of a heaviness in a lot of the work, and then when it sort of shifts to other things, especially, okay, like, how can you make something weird about colonialism, right? That's a tough one. You're just like, oh my God, and Dodge and Burn came out in a very weird and conflicted and confusing way, because colonialism makes no sense. It's a ridiculously horrifying, reality. And so you can present that as a horror show, or you could present it as something that when someone views it, they see it in a different way, from different perspectives, and even not to be funny about it, but just to be like, there's poop emojis pooping on, the bad things. There's different ways to handle that entry point, and that's where I hope maybe that humor actually becomes a way, to slide in. Otherwise, yeah, it is pretty heavy, and yeah, there are funnier things I make, actually. I just didn't show them today, too, so thanks for sharing that.
It's next lecture. But thank you so much, Stephanie, for this amazing talk, and for the questions and the answers, and for sharing so much about your work with us. And thanks to all of you for joining us this evening. Please, the museum is still open, so go see. There's some work by Stephanie up on view on the 3rd floor in the Contemporary Gallery, so please go take a look. And thank you so much for joining us. Have a good night.
Thanks for coming. Thank you.